Hi, welcome to this week's content in Soccer 1050, and this week I'll be looking at youth rights and dissent. So as usual, I'll be splitting it up into a couple of different parts. The first part will be looking at protests or riots, second part looking in detail at the English riots in 2011, and then I'll be looking at the criminalisation of protest. So let's begin with protests or riots. Bit of a kind of reminder from some of the things we've looked at already. The young person as kind of revolutionary subject, as a kind of image of the future I spoke about in the week on figures of youth, and I'm kind of, I suppose, looking at that figure in more detail today. So, as other youth sociologists have pointed out, Sukhariya and Tomic being particular prominent versions, young people quite often are positioned at the vanguard of progressive and emancipatory social movements, and kind of positioned as agents of change. And when they're positioned at this, they're often positioned as threat to kind of the current moral order of the society, or current norms, or economic productivity, or whatever. This is opposed to the other moral panicky kind of distortion of young people, that they're kind of not interested in politics, don't care about anything, and narcissistic and all that kind of thing. So what's interesting about this is they're kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. In research that I did in my PhD, which I think I already discussed, young people are talking about protesting and were told by their teachers and parents that they needed to kind of focus on the self, not worry about society too much. This has also been quite prominent in the more recent school climate change protests. We had our former Prime Minister even, saying that, Scott Morrison saying that, kids shouldn't be worrying about this stuff, they should be at school and these kind of things. So, if kids aren't worried about, the very future of the environment and the climate and, whether societies can function themselves, who should be? And I think that's a really nice encapsulation, really symbolic encapsulation of the problem here, that, dealing with this problem now is really have to be something that the current kind of youth generation are really going to have to face in the future, unless something is done about it. So, it seems to me quite a legitimate thing for young people then to be protesting about and trying to get something done, some actual action on a problem like that. But then they're told to, read a book and do their exams or whatever. So it's important to kind of consider why this is the case. And again, it's relating back to some of those generational things that I was talking about before. But more importantly, in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, in terms of things like protesting or riots, on the blurry line between them sometimes, is how these things are represented, and who benefits from kind of putting large-scale mass dissent as some kind of illegitimate concern or illegitimate practice. Again, as I've also pointed out, that the very act of protesting is increasingly being criminalised, which again seems to kind of threaten some of our long-held democratic rights. So in the following, in all three sections of the content today, I'm going to talk about aspects of this from a sociological perspective. So rather than the kind of blaming unruly youth, or blaming a certain ethnicity or race, or blaming kind of poor people or whatever whenever there's a kind of riots on the streets and protests, there's a number of different sociological, I suppose, theories and concepts or ways of thinking about why dissent may happen on the street in such a large scale. The flashpoint model has been particularly common, and what that kind of does is wants us to think about the social integration of people and why they might feel alienated, why they might feel angry, and think about those 6 different, I suppose, contexts there to consider why something like a riot or a large-scale protest might happen. So to begin with, there's the structural, thinking about the material circumstances of different social groups, their relationship to the state, and how those kind of relationships might lead to conflict. Now, this is obviously something that we need to particularly consider as societies, particularly Western societies, are becoming more unequal. We're now in material inequality circumstances that we haven't seen back to the late 1800s. And so this is also the case, I suppose, as formerly kind of relatively comfortable people in the lower middle classes are also feeling more precarious, more uncertain as, full-time jobs become harder to get. Mortgages are harder to service. This creates a kind of anxiety and an alienation amongst people. There's the political and ideological things to consider. This is the relationship between dissenting groups to political and ideological institutions, and how those dissenting groups are treated by those institutions. So a concept in sociology that you may have heard before is hegemony, and this is the idea that the ruling class can't necessarily always get their own way. There has to be some compromises here and there to allow people, the workers, to get their own way or to have some kind of progress. Otherwise, it may lead to revolution. I think what in this terms of the Flashpoint model points out is that when the state and when powerful groups stop kind of, allowing some forms of progress, or, material circumstances are getting worse, this also may lead to a flashpoint. There's the cultural part, where this is the ways in which different social groups understand the social world and their place in it. And this, I think, is a particular one to think about when you think about the Cronulla riots and how there was, very obvious racist relationships going on between police and Lebanese groups. But then there was also the kind of conflict on the beach about, what the beach is for, who can go there and for what. So there was kind of cultural clashes over what that kind of public space was for. There's the contextual, the long-term and more immediate backdrop to the relationship between particular groups and the police within which disorder occurs. And examples that can be just simply like in terms of the immediate relationship, that a particular group of, say, kids in Western Sydney that hang out in a particular place may have a decent relationship with the police there. They might develop a relationship over time. They might get to even know each other by first name, and it's kind of somewhat mitigates the confrontational nature that can happen between those two groups. If, say, one or two of those police move someone else and a new person comes in, all of a sudden that relationship can really change. And that can then have a real effect on, the relationship between these groups. Pardon me. Fifth is the situational, and this is the spatial and social determinants of this disorder. So this is particularly interesting for thinking about cities, the ways that, particular groups are often living in some sections. There's kind of gated communities where rich people live, and kind of, public housing and places like that, which kind of separate people. In other places, those people are living together more. So you can think about the different relationships that can kind of happen, the way that kind of different conflicts can emerge, simply in terms of the architecture of social space. Lastly is the interactional, the dynamics of interaction between the police and protesters. And we can see this, I suppose, in many of the memes that have happened over the past couple of years, particularly around the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, where you can see, they have like pictures of like you can tell who's turning up to the riot when they're the ones best dressed in battle gear, and you can see the police kind of, almost dressed up as RoboCop. This interactional thing is about the way that kind of powerful forces treat the protesters, treat marginalised groups, and whether they kind of give them a chance to actually have some autonomy and protest about the thing that they're looking at, or whether they actually, often, violently oppose them and often attack them. So this is, again, sociological understandings of kind of different contexts of, what protests are, and how they can kind of lead to, peaceful protests and, people moving on, and sometimes end up being kind of more violent and what's then categorised as a riot. In Australia, in 2006, I think it was, we have what's now commonly called the Cronulla riots. If you're interested in looking at the media representation of this, I put a video in the module about the Media Watch response to Alan Jones, and Alan Jones was kind of was censored by the Australian Communication Authority as kind of seen as being encouraging violence. And what happens in this example very obviously shows the kind of racist nature of our media. So there's some excellent scholarly work in Australia on this. Seek out the work by Greg Noble and Scott Pointing in particular, I think are ones that I'm familiar with. And see their excellent book if you're interested in the way that ethnicity and crime interrelate in Australia. Their book, Kids, Kebabs, Cops and Crime, which predated the Cronulla riots, is an excellent analysis of a couple of particular crimes, the way they were represented in the media, the way they were kind of distorted, and how that kind of plays out. In terms of the Cronulla riots, I think this quote from Cowlinshaw is really kind of sums up some of the aspects that are important to consider. So the Cronulla riot is distinctive in that it is not a subordinate group protesting, as in other cases. It was, white people in Sydney. This is a segment of the dominant group protesting because it imagines itself as marginalised, as being progressively provoked, depowered and humiliated. The riot is where it draws a line in the sand, no pun intended maybe, about what it will tolerate. It sees itself engaged in an ongoing battle encountered in everyday struggles for respect and dignity. Now this relates to some sociological theories that I think are helpful to account for things like, relatively dominant groups like, white people protesting in Cronulla, or more recently the rise of things like anti-vax and QAnon and stuff like that. Certainly when it comes to the racial aspects, there's definitely Islamophobia. And much of the interesting research in Australia kind of looks at it from that perspective, particularly in the kind of post-9/11 world. More broadly, there's the notions of post-colonial melancholia, where previous dominant groups, as there's, some emancipatory progress for marginalised groups, feminism and has made some progress for women in the world, and, there's kind of less overt racism in terms of laws and what can be allowed, even though there isn't any less racism. There is at least a kind of demand on previous dominant groups to kind of, acknowledge that they're, not the centre of the world. It's the centre of everything, and everything should be organised around them and their own desires. Paul Gilroy, who's an amazing UK scholar, writes about how these dominant groups are feeling a kind of melancholy for the past, looking for the past and wanting to go back there in some ways to restore their dominance. So again, this is a kind of interesting conceptual way to think about how people who at the moment seem to be doing quite well out in the world seem to be very angry about things, often angry about people kind of below them in terms of discrimination and marginalisation. In terms of the riots specifically, the ethnographic research after the riot showed how Lebanese groups saw the Cronulla riots as a kind of hyper-real expression of the racism they experience in their everyday life. The abuse and the violence that these Lebanese people experienced in and around the riots, they saw was just kind of, a further confirmation and a further, I suppose, proof of the racism that they were receiving before that, living their lives. As Scott Pointing has pointed out, the battle to reclaim the control of the beach for white Australia mirrored the battle that the then Howard government was waged to reclaim control of the nation itself from asylum seekers and Muslim Middle East enemy, in inverted commas. The political context at the time, and again in the post-September 11 world, was there was a much Islamophobia being stirred up in the political field, using fear to kind of, encourage people to vote in certain ways. So you can see in something like the Cronulla riots, there's a kind of wider social context that an event like that emerges from. And again, if we go back to the kind of flashpoint model, we can unpack, aspects of that, thinking about those different things. So here I'm kind of getting to the point where I'd like you to have a look at a couple of these videos before we move on. Video and a radio thing. There's a video just of what it looks like, what looting looks like, where in the English riots there was people that looking at the team taking stuff out of a mobile phone shop. And there's a friend of mine, Alistair Fraser, who was on BBC Radio's excellent program Thinking Aloud, that is a sociological radio show, doing his analysis of the gangs, and I'll talk about some of that in the next two parts. Okay, thanks.